I think it is. And if it is, fantastic. What is happening, everybody? If everybody's having a fantastic Saturday. If your Saturday involves you watching this, then chances are that your Saturday did not quite go as well as you had hoped. Excellent. All right, so what never seems to fail, Classic Cruiser is in. What's up, man? It's funny, this topic just never will die. It's one of those things where about every 2 to 3 months, I will get a rash of comments, and it's almost like clockwork. And the comments go something like this. New school doesn't make any power the way old school did. New school doesn't have a soul. All this other stuff that'll start coming your way about how great the old stuff was. Coupled with the fact that, the modern stuff, it just doesn't have the same flavor, the modern this, all this other stuff. So I just figured I would throw this back out there. I wanted to give the casual watcher, and it's good in a way because it means that new folks are watching videos, and that's awesome. But again, it's, I guess it's like being a teacher. I mean, every time, the school year starts, you got to start somewhere, and it's the same place you've been starting for forever. So, what we're going to be chatting about is, since the topic is blooming again, let me walk you guys through what the difference is between net horsepower and gross horsepower, about how much power that is, and to put a couple of cars into perspective as far as what their gross horsepower number is versus what their net horsepower number is. So, to get things started, let me go ahead and say what's up to all the early birds getting in here real quick. We've got Classic Cruiser in, Kobe Warren saying, "Sup, B, how's your day?" Day is awesome, man. Thank you for asking. Mark saying, "Professor Mason, what's good, bro?" What's good, man? I'll tell you what, just been a fun day today. So, goofing off, hanging out with the wife, working on Sierra, all kinds of neat stuff. So, what's funny is that, I've got this app on the phone, and it's actually eerily accurate. I took it to the drag strip, and it's one of these quarter mile, timers. It starts and you run, and then it tells you what you ran with a mile an hour. And the mile an hour, for whatever reason, is always either really accurate or really doesn't make any sense accurate. In other words, it's like not even inaccurate. It's like you're not even close kind of accurate. But the ET is practically dead on every single time. And I proved this taking the contraption to the drag strips. Not a draggy, but same kind of an idea, GPS tracker. Anyway, my time slip said I ran a 10.4 at 133, and not with Sierra, but with the Hellcat, and with the app, it said I went a 10.4 at 133 or 134. So, it was 133. So anyway, I had the app with me. I've been doing a little bit of work to Sierra, and I took her out tonight. Had a little bit of a cool down here. And ran the truck, and the truck clicked off a 14.8. Now, to put things into perspective, this truck behind me, it's a 3/4 ton GMC, has absolutely no business running a 14.8, but yet here we are, and does it very traction limited as well. I'm really feathering the throttle to get her to hook before I can even go to wide open throttle. In fact, it's a lot like... Y'all are going to laugh about this, but if I wanted to train somebody how to launch a 392 car or a Hellcat on the street, I would toss them the keys to Sierra. It is identical launching Sierra versus launching a Scat Pack car or a Hellcat on a set of drag radials on the street, coupled with the fact that it's basically the same weight. So anyway, I've got this old 400 small block in this truck that is ripping now low 15s and high 14s on the street with all-terrain tires. And she did get her first kill tonight, a diesel, somebody's turbo diesel Ford. So anyway, tore that truck a new ass. But that's what I've been doing with Sierra. Sierra's running like a freaking banshee. The only thing I need to do right now with Sierra is She needs a new starter. If I run her for a while and then shut her off, there's a chance that she won't refire because the starter just gets hot. So you just got to pop the hood and let her cool off for about 10 minutes, and usually it'll fire right back up, 10 or 20 minutes, and she's back on her feet. But aside from that, it truck lights right off. It is a lot of fun. So anyway, that's the latest Sierra news. KDC is saying, what's up? Gary Fuller is saying, what's up? Got the arm flexes. I like it. Mike G's in. Moto X is in. John Cusack saying, loving the streams. Keep it up. Thank you much. Let's see. Craig's in. Hayden is saying, hope all is well. Question, have you tuned or seen a 454 Hemi Striker setup? Nope, nowhere near it. I hear they make 600 plus to the wheels, maybe on a very, very, very generous dyno jet. What's your opinion on big displacement aluminum Gen 3 Hemi? I think it's a complete waste of money. Yeah, you can do it. The heads will support, I'll put it like this. The heads on the Hemi, the way that it's set up from factory, will support about 625, 650 horsepower. You put a CNC port on it, a little bit bigger valves, a valve job. It'll support about 720, so you can absolutely get there from here. I know of guys that have messed with it. I haven't had to tune any of them. Cam specs on them are typically, 235 on the intake side, 245 or 242 on the intake side, in that range, and they'll go up to 250 on the exhaust side. Looks a lot like a kind of your garden variety 8-second Hellcat cam, for me, it doesn't, you're not going to get me there. I mean, what's the point? If I want 600 plus horsepower to the rear wheels, I just go out into my garage and press a button. And I understand the arguments for them. I get it. High compression, run the thing on E85. The thing is that nobody really takes it in the right direction. My opinion of those types of engines is that, look, you need to have the sniper intake, the heads, the cam, the displacement, all of that. That's where it all works together really well. But you got to get the compression up, and you need to be running on E85 to realistically get the most out of that engine. You're going to be looking at 13 and a half, 14 and a half to 1 compression, in my opinion, as a minimum. And then it's no longer a pump gas engine. I'll put you like this, dragging that engine into the weeds with about an 11 to 1 compression ratio. And now you're kind of back to the, 570, 580 horsepower to the rear wheels on a Mustang dyno, which will kind of get you into that range-ish on a dyno jet. It's a lot of freaking coin, man. I mean, a lot of coin. So if you're just all about the NA life, I say go for it. But right now, it wouldn't be my cup of tea, because for the amount of money that you're going to drop on that thing, you can have a Hellcat that'll put over 800 of the rear wheels on accident. 600, 800. See what I mean? They're cool. They're a curio thing, but that's about it. Mark saying, "What's up?" Kobe Warren saying, "What do you think of the 427 big block versus the 427 small block?" I prefer, you're talking about the LS small block or like a Stroker SBC. LS small block, like an LS7, I'd prefer that over the Iron Block 427 if we're talking about Chevrolet type stuff. Ford, same thing. I mean, I've had both, well, not the side oiler, but I've had large displacement, big block Ford engines, and I've had a Stroker small block 427. One thing you have to remember is if you're talking true big block versus true small block, weight is a major factor for the big blocks. They're typically not going to be as twitchy as the small blocks. You're going to build a small block with the compression that you want. The big block, you're typically just working with what you've got. So, a a modified small block is a hot rodded engine at that displacement versus what is normally just a factory big block. A factory big block, when you go hot rodding that, then you can stroke that, more displacement, the whole bit gets kicked off there. And now it's just a big bank take little bank game, and you go from there. So I guess for purposes of conversation, I would say stroker small block for me, because I can control everything about that engine, where the big blocks, except for quite a few, but except for a few, they were mostly just tank motors. They didn't rev past about 4,000 RPM anyway. So hopefully that answers the question for you. Bruce is checking in saying, man, I was always excited to learn more from the master as a 25-year-old and no one around to give me knowledge. I'm blessed to have you, B. Mason. Well, thanks for having me, brother. And CJ is saying, what's up? How's it going? It's going good, my man. So let's get started. And listen, guys, if I don't get to you, I apologize, but it kind of is what it is. I might be cherry picking some comments as we go along tonight. So first and foremost, we've got to get past the elephant in the room, which is net horsepower versus gross horsepower. Why is there a difference? And which one is accurate? Is one of them not accurate? Trick question, they're both accurate. So let me explain to you what gross horsepower is and why they used it back then. Gross horsepower is you take an engine, you take the engine with no alternator, maybe a water pump, maybe not, no air cleaner. Typically it'll have headers on it and maybe an extension, maybe not. You put that on the dyno and you run it. And you optimize the tune with it on the dyno and you get the number, okay? The number, let's call it 400 horsepower because it's easy to work with. You get this horsepower number of 400 and you look at it, you start to look at it objectively and you go, okay, well, there's no power steering pump, there's no alternator, there's no air cleaner, there's no other front engine accessory drive with everything else that could be on that front engine accessory drive. There's no full exhaust, there's no manifolds. So that number is kind of a pie in the sky false number, right? Absolutely not, because you have to understand you have to look at it from the point of view of the manufacturer at the time and how they used to rate engines just in general. So an engine manufacturer would make an engine. It is a power plant. It is there to do reciprocating, make loud noises, and do things. There is no accounting for what platform that thing is going to go in. Our 400 horsepower engine, our fictional 400 horsepower engine, could be going into a passenger vehicle, could be going into a truck, it could be a power unit, it could be going into a stationary, like a pump or a generator type of an application. It could be going into any of these. It could be going into a boat, could be going into an airplane. Our engine doesn't know what it's going to be powering, and neither do we as the manufacturer, our fictitious, God, what, it just blew up my face, our fictitious company here. So we are going to rate the engine as a power plant with the understanding that once you start putting that power plant into engines, there will be parasitic losses along the way that will be specific to your individual platform's requirements, needs, and just how that particular platform is going to become a parasitic loss just in general, where it could be exhaust routing, it could be under hood temperatures, access to fresh air, it could be any of these things. All of those are going to systematically remove power from this engine, but you have something as a reference point. Our 400 horsepower engine could be 400 horsepower, or it could be as low as 300 horsepower if tested with all the rest of the stuff that goes on these things. That's the why behind gross horsepower. Back then, again, power plants were used to power all kinds of things. And so to have an exact, literal to the nth degree setup on the dyno is just impractical at the time. So now you say you have a 400 horsepower engine. Well, you really don't, or it's not really making 400 horsepower, but with some tweaks, it could probably get fairly close. Well, net horsepower, engineers in general started looking at that. People were complaining because vehicles weren't performing as they should. And it was kind of easy to fudge the numbers. A lot of people will say, oh, those engines back then were underrated. I got news for you. I've put my hands on a lot of those engines. I've had Hemis on the dyno. I've had 440s on the dyno. I've had side oiler 427s. I've had L88s. Probably one of the few that was actually underrated, by the way. 428 Cobra Jet stuff. A lot of the older stuff. And no, they didn't make the power you would think that they would, but they were, for the most part, rated about right, but none of them made power like you would, the legendary numbers. Oh, that's so, it really made another 150 horsepower. Not even close. The worst offender of this, the worst offender of this would have probably been the Hemis and the 440s. The Dodges were a little bit, how do you say, optimistic with what the engines were making in the car. Now, that's not to say that on a dyno they wouldn't cover a number, but in the car, not quite the same. So anyway, there's your explanation of gross horsepower. Net horsepower, again, there was a push to make the numbers a bit more realistic. How does the engine actually perform as it is installed in the vehicle with exhaust manifolds and air cleaners and all these other things? And by the way, before I get too far, there were net horsepower figures at the same time that there were gross horsepower figures. The thing is that they just really weren't ever used. They were never used in advertising. They were just known factors and known figures for engines. I'll tell you what, as a homework assignment, just go in and look up 1971 426 cubic inch hemispherical headed large displacement Dodge motor. Look up the 71 426 Hemi, look at the horsepower and torque and report back. You will be shocked as to the number that comes up. But even before, because in 1971, manufacturers started to rate engines both ways. They would say, 400 gross, 300 net. You would see them rated both ways. The last year of the Hemi, it actually was rated that way. And it's a creepy number. It's a creepy number and it's low. All right. Way lower than you might think, but it makes sense based on what kind of numbers those cars turned back then and the weight and everything else. So with net horsepower, this is one of the reasons why the same engine would be a little bit different rated car to car to car. Differences in packaging would restrict exhaust flow, could restrict air intake configurations, could make access to cold air more difficult. Areas where you can't have timing at certain values because of EPA restrictions. All of that started to really come into play. So yes, the numbers went down, but the engines didn't lose any power. There was still quite a bit of pretty hot motors even into the 70s. They just weren't rated in gross horsepower numbers. Now, what's the difference in terms of percentages, one versus the next? Well, I'll tell you this. In my research and from what I've been able to gather, there is, for performance-oriented engines, which in this case, you would read that or listen to that to hear with factory dual exhaust. The engines with factory dual exhaust would have roughly a 20% difference between your gross and your net horsepower numbers. So in other words, if you had an engine that was rated at 360 horsepower, you would, as a net number, expect that engine now to be at 300 horsepower, give or take. There may be some packaging liberties given with some of the hotter motors, but the reality is that it was about 20%. And you would just take the gross number and multiply it by, 0.8, like you would expect, or divide by 0.8 the lower horsepower number to get its approximate gross horsepower figure. If the engine, on the other hand, was originally equipped with a single exhaust and a two-barrel, usually those engines suffered from about a 30% difference in power from the gross horsepower to the net. Good freaking God, man. By the way, body count on Skeeters today was about 6, but we're not doing that in here because I don't get Skeeters in here. But throughout the course of the day, yeah, we're getting Skeeters. So anyway, the reason for the two-barrel, and it usually would ride in concert with the two-barrel engines, that they would have a single exhaust. They just, very rarely did you see a two-barrel with factory exhaust, is that when those two-barrel engines were tested, they were tested with a set of headers. So the difference was fairly significant in terms of the power between one versus the next. An economy setup versus something that you're just testing as a power unit. So again, getting back to what is the difference between the two, roughly 20% as from a margin standpoint, from gross to net. And that's for performance engines, and for the lesser, this is for V8s now, for the lower tier V8s that were running like a two-barrel or a small four-barrel and a single exhaust, that number would be 30% from gross to net. So as you're talking about these engines from back in the day, this is in essence how they would play out. Now, a lot of folks have said, this is what cracks me up. So a lot of folks have said, well, a lot of manufacturers, they lower tier rated some of these horsepower numbers for insurance purposes. Bullshit. No, they did not. I've seen Hemis on the dyno. I've seen LS6 454s on the dyno, both massaged and stock. I played with all of them. 455 is probably one of my more favorite engines, the Buick 455, and the Pontiac 455 for that matter. More like the 400, but the Buick 455, fun engine. Guys, I'm here to tell you, if they could advertise 5,000 horsepower, they would have done it. You're talking about engines that at that point in time, the horsepower number won the race, right? So anyway, hopefully that sets some things straight a little bit for you, just in terms of how the numbers were set and the mentality and everything else from back in the day. Let me catch up with some of y'all real quick, and then we'll get back into some of this. CJ saying, hey, what's up? What's up, man? Challenger 50 saying, I've owned all the old stuff from a 62 Impala 409 to a 70 RT Charger 446 pack. New stuff is a lot better, more complicated, but better. I would agree with that 100%. CJ's asking if I've heard about the Motown, the LS block, which is basically an LS and an SBC hybrid. What that does is it bolts LS heads and intakes onto SBC blocks. I've heard of it, and I think it's pretty cool. I haven't messed with any of it, but I have heard of it. Hayden's got the thumbs up. Mike's saying, thinking of shorty headers for my 5.7 Challenger, though everyone's telling me just to skip them for long tubes if I'm just trolling around on the streets and not hitting wide open throttle all the time. Are they worth it? Okay, look, anything is better than what you got. So let's start off the conversation there. But if you're just kicking it on the street, bro, I got to be honest with you. Long tubes are going to be your better friend because long tubes promote better partial throttle torque production, and they're better for just torque down low in general, up to about 3,200 RPM. Problem is you're going to need a tune with either one that you go with because they create and generate more racket, which will piss off your knock sensors, which means it's going to start really throwing out a bunch of knock retard, which is going to kill power in general. So you got to tune it before you start playing with any of those things. About the only upgrade that you can do that you may not need a tune for, and I mean may not need a tune. I'm not saying you don't, because they're still a little bit more noisy. But if you get a set of Hellcat or 392 or 61 manifolds, headers, shorties, and the exhaust system to go along with it, it will, because they're insulated, which is to say that they just don't make as much noise under the hood, which is good because that noise is what pisses off your knock sensors. That will be a better way to go about a solution if you don't have a tune. And I'm not even going to tell you that that won't piss off your knock sensors. So anyway, hopefully that answers your question. CJ's saying the 6.2 single overhead cam Boss V8. Okay. Sovereign saying, hey, what's up? Sovereign saying gross with no parasitics. That's correct. AKA crank. Chris is asking, are the 6.1s common to get a Hemi tick? No, not at all. Not even close to that with those cars. I've never even heard of one with a tick. 1320J saying, great recommendations on the MT Street comps. Oh, great tire. Thanks. Very cool. Glad you like them. Silver Knight saying, drivetrain accessories, etc., all account for gross horsepower losses. That is correct. Chris is asking, could you say a bore and stroke to a 6.1 is the most bang for your buck? No. It just depends on what you're going after with that engine. The problem is bore and stroke. Yeah, kind of. I mean, you could step it up to like a 417 or something like that. Cam somewhere in like the 224, 232 range. LSA of around 113, 115. If it's a street car, I would have a hard time recommending that because you're not going to get you're still looking at cam. You're going to be disassembling the whole thing. You're looking at a lot of money to get that 6.1 board stroke, which obviously cam, tune, injectors, and everything else you're going to need to go along with it. Exhaust system. This is one of those issues where it's hard to recommend that if you're wanting more power and you've got that kind of money to spend. You're almost better off finding a 6.4 car. Find a 392 or, a 1320 would be a great opportunity, get you into something like that is going to have an inherently higher resale value than what you currently have now, and it'll maintain that for longer. That's not to say I don't like the 6.1 stuff. I actually really do like the 6.1 stuff. But for me, a tune with a set of long tubes and just let her eat with that, with the 6.1. I try not to recommend a lot of overcomplication with those engines because there's just not, how do I say this? There's just not enough return to get anything really out of it. So anyway, hopefully that answers your question, man. Summer Night saying, and a tune. Yep. Hey, CJ, awesome. Lots of engines can make over 600 horsepower. A 6.4 with a cam and a ported intake and an 85 millimeter throttle body and long tubes. If you were to put that on a dyno jet, like an engine dyno, that makes over 600 horsepower. So it's not hard anymore to make 600 horsepower. 600 horsepower really, it's weird. It's very strange to hear this, but that 500 horsepower dyno jet number will put you at roughly 600 horsepower to the crank. That number is, it's not that it's not impressive, but it's just so common nowadays that it muddles up the conversation. Great. So it's a modded engine and it makes 600 horsepower. No kidding. Monty Red saying, "Sup, Professor Beat? What's up, man?" Cody saying, old school had more torque. Sorta. See, here's the thing. Old school stuff, which I know a little bit about, Exhibit A as well. Old school stuff had more tip-in torque, if you want to give them any credit whatsoever. The problem is, the reality is they did not have more torque. The corporate 5.7 with a variable runner intake in a truck, in a Ram pickup truck, is going to have a significant amount of torque across a very broad range. That same engine displacement would have nowhere near the amount of torque that 5.7 that's in your pickup truck has. And it certainly wouldn't have anywhere near the 400 horsepower, the net 400 horsepower that engine does. If we're talking about big blocks and you're saying, okay, well, we're going to compare even one of the smog era 400s. If y'all know me, I kind of, Sierra's got a 400 small block. It's only impressive in displacement, though. You have to remember that the smog era 400s, both Chevy, Ford, and all three of them, Dodge had the 400 era engines. They do make a lot of tip-in torque, and they're impressive actually to drive. More impressive, by the way, than some big blocks are. And I'll put it to you like this. This truck behind me pulls like it's got a big block in it. The problem is that it dumps torque. It literally, if you look at the power curve, if it's got a good torque number, it's got a good peak, and then it just hemorrhages power after that torque peak. So that is to say, at wide open throttle, what about tip-in torque? Larger displacement engines obviously will always have more tip-in torque. The problem is for how long? And that is one of the key issues that you run into when you're comparing the older engines, is that you've got to go so far up in displacement to get to some of the torque numbers that the modern engines are making. So yeah, the older engines had more torque, but they were also significantly larger. And for a lot of them, they just ran out of steam real quick. And that's always one of the criticisms of the 440, is that in stock form, they just freaking lay over. I mean, there's just, after about 4,500 RPM, 4,600 RPM, they just start to lay over, and it makes sense. I mean, if you look at them, the ports are tiny, they don't flow a lot of air, but they've got crazy port velocity because of that displacement. So when you're talking about those older engines, yeah, people talk about them saying, oh, they had all this, they made all this, much more torque and everything else. Yeah, sort of. But you almost have to dissect that statement. One, they had 3-speed transmissions if we're talking about automatics, or some standards for that matter. And a 4-speed manual was there because it gave you an extra gear. But you only had 3 speeds to work with, so torque multiplication was kind of a big deal. And so if you had more torque, then you could multiply that by the smaller multiplier and get the thing moving a little bit quicker. Sound familiar? So that's one of the things that you would see. You would almost have to have the larger engine. The problem with that is, where do you break down horsepower, production, and actual drivability? If you've got this big engine, if you tune it and put a set of heads on it and a cam and make it kind of a racy engine, it's not going to have the torque to deal with that torque multiplication. The good thing is that cars were significantly lighter back then. Give you an idea, like a 67 Chevelle only weighed like 3,600 pounds, maybe 37 on a stretch. Whereas most of the cars today that we're dealing with are over 4,000 pounds, 4,200, 4,300 in the case of all the Mopars. So without the torque multiplication, they're kind of a dog. And without the torque down low, they're going to feel like kind of a turd until they kind of come into their own. But to get there, that means that you might have some starting issues. There's going to be some other minor just pains in the ass that you're going to run into. So, yeah, they had more torque, but was the torque there because it had to be just to make the car drivable? I don't know. I'll let actual sales of Hemi cars versus 440 cars answer that question. And believe me when I tell you, $850 back then was not all that much money to spend if the Hemi was all that much more better of an engine, and it wasn't. You drive a 440 and then drive a Hemi, you'll wonder if somebody pulled two freaking spark plugs off the 440 and then gave you a set of keys just driving the thing around. Cody's asking, how do you get more high-end torque? Well, there's two ways to do it. Aside from a centrifugal supercharger, which is a legit way to get more higher end torque because it pushes torque further out, you have to make the engine more efficient out in those RPM ranges. In some cases, that's heads, cam, intake, throttle body, all the rest of that will give you torque peak at a higher RPM. And this is one of the things, by the way, it's a good question because it kind of segues into camshafts and how they make more power. If you're making 300 pound-feet of torque at 5,250 RPM, if you're making 300 pound-feet of torque at that RPM, because that's your pivot RPM, then you're making the same number in horsepower. If you're making more torque, let's say you're making 300 pound-feet of torque at 6,000 RPM, you're going to be making a lot of horsepower. That's going to be like a 500 horsepower engine or something like that. If your peak torque number is at 3,000 RPM and then it starts falling from there drastically, then your peak horsepower may only be 250. So it's the camshaft just moves that torque peak around. A lot of times the power number will go with it, but the power number may flatten out a little bit. And the reason for that is you're just running out of cylinder head or intake manifold, or there's going to be a flow restriction kicking in at that point. But like with these Hemis, the idea is just to try to move that torque out a little bit and let the thing breathe out on the big end. Might not necessarily make a lot more power, but if you can shift that torque curve over by about 500 RPM or so, it'll keep the thing in its power band as it's going down the freeway, like from a roll. So anyway, one of the more challenging things to deal with these Hemis. Hang on. Hey, Gary, thank you very much. Saying thank you for all your knowledge on the live chats. Thank you very much for the contribution to the cause. Your contribution dollars at work. So, yeah, I'll be getting a new starter for Sierra here pretty soon. That will be coming before you know it, hopefully. Let's see. Let me get back to it. But anyway, Cody, hopefully that answered your question. Typically, you're going to be moving that number over. Now, the idea, okay, how do you get more torque? You know, the trucks and the 6.4 cars with their variable runner intake, that also helps to propagate torque at higher RPM. And what that does, it just basically shortens the runner, or shortens the active runner profile of the runner at higher RPM. And that's why you would see that little bump, and then it would carry over for the torque. For those cars, when you see them on a dyno, that's what that's doing. Without it, it'll just kind of drop down. So give you an idea as far as how that works. Modern Red saying, bit off topic, we ran a 1089 today with Shake and Bake. Just tuned her on 85 on Wednesday. Very nice. Very nice. Hey, Randy's checking in from Middle Tennessee. I like it. Sorry, brother, late to the party. Very nice. I like that, though. Better late than never. Sovereign's hanging out with Cody. Let's see. Cody's saying push rods tend to be more torquey-ish over higher revving overhead cams. Kind of. Let's see. Moto X is saying, can old 426 Hemi with fuel injection work better than dual carbs? Yeah, a whole lot better. If it's done the right way, if you basically set it up with an intake like what you would see on a 6.1 or even a dual runner style intake, yeah, it would do significantly better. The dual quad thing, not really good. It was a means to an end before there was the better designed single 4-barrel carburetors. But unless you're talking about a tunnel ram or something like that, dual quad is never going to be as good as a single quad. It looks cool, but it's a major throwback style induction system. Let's see. Dad's Garage saying, guys, hit the thumbs up. Yeah, hit the thumbs up, guys. Helps out a ton. Monterey saying, a little spoiler alert. Summer Night saying 6.4, likes those engines. So do I. Frederick saying, what's poppin', B? Got the bald dude with the shades. I like it. Oh, yeah. Uncle Stakeford saying, what up? Saying, as someone who grew up around old school muscle, new is definitely better. I drove a 67 Chevelle 396 for a little bit. Great car. Love my 392 Charger more. 392 Charger more. So it's funny you mentioned that 396 Chevelle. The way that this truck runs is almost identical to the Motor Trend Road and Track numbers that they were getting out of 3.25 and 350 horse Chevelles with an automatic. Big block cars. Uncle Steve was saying, yeah, old school most certainly did not have more torque. Cody's saying, tire technology and transmission technology has changed the game for cars today. Well, that's a lot of it right there. I mean, first of all, let's take a look at the differences in transmissions. You know, you guys got to remember that when the 5-speed automatic was released for the Mustangs, what was it, in 2005? That was like a huge thing. And here's the funny thing. Everybody was buying 5 and 6-speed cars because the automatics were just not performance-oriented automatics. And everybody was running around saying, God, if they only had a 5-speed automatic, you'd have 4 gears and an overdrive. It would be the same as a manual, right? So then they came out with a 5-speed, and all of a sudden, 12-second cars started becoming a little bit more common at that stage of the game. Didn't change the game. It wasn't mind-altering, okay? But it was pretty close to getting you on track. It was basically setting your eyes straight. Then you started seeing the 6-speed automatics and then the 8-speed automatics, obviously later on. But the 5 and 6-speed automatics were kind of a big deal at the time. And yeah, I mean, that is really where the game started to change. And now at 8-speed automatics, 9-speed automatics, 10-speed automatics, you know, where does that stop? Well, I don't know where it stops. Well, I kind of do know where it stops. It stops with EVs, but you can kind of get the idea of what I'm saying. You're simply just not going to have the driving experience that you're going to have with one of these more performance-oriented automatics. And by the way, you know, people talk about converters for these HP 70s and HP 90s, and it's kind of funny when you look at the data. If you actually data log these cars, if you take these things to a drag strip on a sticky tire and mat the throttle, they will come up to 3,000 RPM and hang there. It's just like wing, and then it'll start to roll over. It's pretty funny. That has nothing to do with torque management or anything else. It's just hanging on the converter at about 3,000 RPM. So the modern automatics are not only more efficient because they have the more gear multiplication, but they're more performance oriented. And, you know, a performance oriented automatic trumps manual transmission every time. Again, folks were buying automatics because they were consistent and they were comfortable back in the day. The performance guys were always rowing their own. But nowadays, It's flipped. Nostalgia is there for the manual transmission. A lot of guys prefer that if they're up, playing around up in the hills and, just kind of goofing off, hooning around with their cars. But if you're looking for a number and you're at a drag strip and you're looking for acceleration numbers, that automatic's going to win that every single time. And part of it, you can't shoot as fast as an automatic. Fair enough. But you also won't have the same gear multiplication that you will with an automatic. 510 saying, what up, B? Got the arm flex saying, I've had old school and new stuff. I put new 6.4 Hemi in an old school 70 Duster. It's cam with headers with a T56. Most fun this car has ever been. I bet. That sounds like a riot. The Duster's been through a lot of hot small blocks. The Hemi hands down wins. Those heads flow 300 plus CFM. Can't beat it. Yeah, they're crazy how much those heads flow. In fact, 300 plus is an understatement. I think the lowest number I've ever seen on any of the, like a 15 and up Hemi, 330, and that's including the 5.7, maybe 340 out of the heads that you'll find on the 6.2s and the 6.4s for sure. X is saying, Hemi Mason, I got my Ride Tech coilover kit and it comes in pieces with vague instructions and there's no video how to put it together. You think for $2,000 it would come in ready to go in the car? True that, man. Modern Red saying 40 watching and 14 likes. Hit that like button. For sure, hit the like button. Like, subscribe, share, do all the good stuff. Actually, it helps a ton because of YouTube analytics and all that. It's not the same as what it used to be. So the likes, the subscribes, the hit the bell and all of that, it does really make a difference, guys. If you've got channels that you enjoy watching, don't just subscribe to them, hit the bell. It does mean a lot. And the funny thing is that the older, like guys that have been doing this for a little bit, it's kind of interesting because you have subscribed to a channel, right? You think you're going to get all their content, but you don't. And there's channels that I'm subscribed to that I still have had to go in and remind myself, oh yeah, I've got to make sure I hit the bell because if I don't, I may not get any of their content. So kind of a weird thing on how that works. Let's see. Oh, CJ's talking about something in Australia. It's not a bara. I'm not Kara. Let's see. And thanks again, Gary. I appreciate that. Cody's asking, how would I do that on a bone stock 4-cylinder turbo? I don't know. What are we still talking about? Hey, CJ, I don't really, you're telling it. Okay, so I will talk about this. Saying most Ford EcoBoost engines make torque at 2,200 RPM while the NA makes torque at 4,500 RPM. So, and what's your point? First of all, yeah, they do. And they do it under boost, which means that they have a significantly richer mixture at that RPM, which means that if they're making more power, they need more fuel, which means that the EcoBoost at that RPM making the torque spread that they do is using more fuel than the NA engine. And this goes back to where a lot of guys had basically gotten a little bit butthurt. And I think that they're actually talking about at one point a class action lawsuit basically on behest of the fact that the engines just didn't have this, fuel economy that they were promised. And the reason for that is because they had them in boost all the time. If you take a little engine and you put turbochargers on it, and you are now making a 2.5 liter or a 3 liter engine make 400 horsepower and 400 pound-feet of torque, think of what fuel requirements that power plant is going to have, what kind of cylinder pressures it's going to have, what kind of cylinder temperatures it's going to have, and then think of the fueling requirements that it's going to take per cubic inch or per cubic centimeter, however you want to measure it, to deal with that type of power. It's going to be a significant amount more fuel, and it's also going to be at a lower timing value. And so the air fuel ratio goes incredibly rich, whereas the NA engine probably going to be at partial throttle because you're not going to be at wide open throttle at 2200 RPM normally. And so you're not going to be in a very high load condition at that point anyway. So that's really where all that is coming from. And for the guys that are, it's always, well, if you just, makes more torque at 2000 RPM. Let me tell you how much time I spend at 2000 RPM if I'm accelerating, like none. So anyway, a lot of that starts to fall in the area of power enrichment mode, which is to say you're not wide open throttle, but you are in fact in boost in that scenario, and probably a fairly significant amount of boost during that power enriched mode, depending on how your throttle mapping is set. So there's a lot that goes into it, but yeah, that torque range is also, you're also working with a significant amount of exhaust temperature issues. Is one of the reasons why they eat up catalytic converters. You're also going to be taxing cooling systems and everything else because you're dumping significantly more heat into the cooling system. So you would assume that it's engineered to deal with that, though. Trust me. It is. But again, the idea is still the same. The net result, lower fuel economy numbers. Mike saying, got a strut tire brace to complement the new front sway bar I got from my ride. Do Challengers really benefit from a rear sway bar and brace, or should I just give my wallet a rest for now? I would say chill with it for just a minute. There is a rear brace that, man, I don't know that it helps a whole lot. And the reason why I say I don't know that it helps a whole lot is because I've known guys that have had it and they reported that they couldn't tell that they had it. If you're building an all-out race car, you're gutting it, you're going to be running it on super sticky tires, you're going to be going out and just carving up corners on a closed circuit, there might be something to it. But man, for what the vast majority of what guys are going to be working with and playing with around on the street, and even an autocross and some, open circuit track racing time trials, I don't know that you're going to see much of a difference. I mean, it ain't going to hurt nothing. I'll put it to you that way, but just don't be expecting something huge on the back end of that. See, Moto X saying his 70 RT Charger with a 440 had more torque than some Caprice. All right. Jordana's asking, what was your first performance engine? Damn, you almost have to define performance. So when I was extremely young, and I mean real young, I was learning how to drift an old Dodge truck with a 225 slant six. Would you call that a performance engine? I don't know if I would, but I was hanging that truck sideways with my grandfather laughing his ass off right next to me. After that was a 69 El Camino with a 350. It's a 4-barrel car, but I wouldn't really call it a performance setup, but that was the second one that I was hanging the ass end out on, and I really enjoyed that thing. So, would you call that performance? I guess you kind of could. I mean, it was a blast for me. I ended up being it was more vicarious through other folks. So I guess I would have to say that the first one that I owned would have been my 1996 Mustang GT single overhead cam car that I was trying to learn that platform, because you got to remember I had either worked on or driven other people's Mustangs and Chevy trucks and you name it, everything else. I just didn't own it. And then after that, the Fox body stuff that I got into. So, the stuff that I worked on the most was always Fox body stuff growing up because everybody had Fox body Mustangs. And so, would you call that I guess that would be about the most performance engine, but just in terms of stuff that I played around with when I was a kid, stuff that was in the family, those would be the two. And those are the most endearing for me. So we're saying, want to go fast, ditch that polyglass. Tuxedo saying, hey, B. Mason, how are you? Did you do anything cool today? Hey, Tux, what's up, man? Ran a high 14 with Sierra today on the app, so I was really stoked about that. Very traction limited, mind you, but she'll still cover the number. And then, the wife and I had a chance to hang out for quite a bit today, so I was really stoked about that. Let's see. Tux, I think, oh, cool. Just answered that question. Got a big drawing project. Cool, man. Stay on top of it. Sovereign saying, I'd imagine those EcoBoost 4-cylinders wear out pretty quickly. Here's funny. The funny thing is I had, what were those little escape things or whatever? Anyway, it had one of the 2.3 EcoBoost engines in it. And one of the funnier thing about it was that thing got terrible fuel mileage. The fuel economy was terrible in that thing. And the reason for it being terrible is I had my foot buried in it all the time because it was so much fun. So, I don't think you're going to get this thing back with. I was just always having a lot of fun with those things. Let's see. X-Cash is saying, is the front brace really worth it? I have the shaker hood and the front brace cost almost $500 for 2 pieces of metal. Man, I mean, it just depends on what you're doing with the car, man. If you're actively going out and hitting back roads and doing a lot of handling things, then yeah, it can help a little bit. You got to remember the cars have you've got a strut brace in the car already. The other brace just kind of, augments that a little bit, or rather it takes the place of the stock brace and it just makes it a little bit stiffer. But, does it make a difference? For most folks, no. I don't run any of the aftermarket braces. All of my stuff is from the factory. I haven't seen any issues with it. Haven't had a need for it. Chris is asking, what is your opinion on the newer 5.7 versus the 6.1 from the SRT8? Well, see, here's the problem. The 6.1 technically does make more power than the 5.7. You've got to distinguish which 5.7 you're talking about, though. Are you talking about the car 5.7 or the truck 5.7? The car 5.7 at roughly 375 horsepower is down in power compared to the 6.1, but you factor in the 8-speed automatic versus the NAG 1, and that does a lot to level the playing field. 6.1 will typically be just a little bit quicker than that 5.7. Tire for tire, car for car, you kind of get the idea with that. Plus, it's got the panache of being an SRT8, but the 5.7 is not that far behind that car. And so, all things considered, I would say I'd probably rather have the 5.7. I'd probably rather have the 6.1 over the 5.7, whether it's a dead heat or what. It still is the, kind of the de facto winner just because it's the SRT8. That's taking nothing away from the 5.7 cars, though. And man, listen, truth be told, if the 5.7 just had some of the tricks that the 6.4's got, it would be right there with the 6.1, or in fact, even quicker than the 6.1 with just a set of 6.1 manifolds and an exhaust system. So there's that to consider. But the reality is that, they're close. If I'm going to own one, I would probably prefer the 6.1, and just know that the difference is not all that big between the two. The 6.1, I will say this, the 6.1's got a little bit more of an old school flavor to it, so that's another reason why I would probably pick it. Let's see. Got some of y'all chatting. I like it. Tux, that truck is an automatic. Ken saying, new school at the track, no need for roll bar, cage, or aftermarket seat belts. Just make sure to use a dot drag tire and you can drive it to and from the track. So good point that Ken's making. One of the things that I will tell you about the old school stuff is that you have kind of an interesting situation with the old school versus the new school cars. Only have 3 gears to play with, and I got a 411 gear in the thing, so there is no top speed. This truck at wide open at about 90 miles an hour, it starts to nose over. In fact, at about 94, 95 miles an hour, you haven't maxed it out, but you have all but maxed it out because you just literally run out of gear at that point. And you run out of RPM. I mean, the engine just doesn't spin that high. That engine is done at 4,700 RPM. So, pulling that thing to 5,000 RPM, you're just not going to do that in top gear. It might eventually get to 100 miles an hour, but it would take a while. But it'll sure as hell get to 90 miles an hour real quick. So, but yeah, for sure. Let's see, what happened here? Let's see. Oh, but yeah, if that thing had a tire on it, it'd be scary quick in the 8th for what it is. Let's see. Dad's Garage, thank you very much. Saying for the best live on YouTube. Appreciate that, buddy. And saying for saving me 20 grand last week. No problem, man. So what Dad's is talking about is, talking about the 6.4 versus the Hellcat. As a Hellcat owner and as a former 6.4 SRT owner, 392 SRT owner, I can tell you that on the street, on a tire, a 392 powered car, whether it's a Charger or a Challenger, is going to be incredibly difficult to mess with stoplight to stoplight. They're really, I'm not going to say that you don't have to think about it, but the reality is that unless you're running on a set of DBRs on the street with your Hellcat, that 392 is going to scald you from like 0 to 60, 0 to 80. It's going to be hell to pay 0 to 100 for the 392, but getting to the number, you'll be laughing your ass off while the guy in the Hellcat is trying to figure out what is happening. So I have on a couple of occasions not really lamented having the Hellcat. Love the Hellcat. Wouldn't trade the Hellcat away. In fact, eerily enough, that'll be kind of the topic for an upcoming chat, but I can't find anything else that I'd rather have than that Hellcat. And, the Hellcat might be the answer to the question that I've had of, what can I find that I would actually want to keep and hold on to? Man, I'm having a real hard time finding something that I want more than that Hellcat. Now, with all that being said, if you look at the 392 cars without looking at the supercharged variants, okay, leave the supercharged variants aside and only pay attention to the NA cars, The freaking 392 is really, really stout. I mean, it is the quickest to the 1,000-foot mark out of all of the variants. No matter which one you pick, Camaro, Mustang, it don't matter. Stock for stock, you're going to be sniffing Dodge ass all the way down the drag strip. And it makes the car torquey, fun. You can use all the horsepower that you paid for. All of that means something. It's important, and it is a huge, and it plays a huge part in the ownership satisfaction of those cars. It's only when you start to compare it to the Hellcats, the ZL1s, and everything else that starts the conversation with supercharger, that's where that car starts to suffer by comparison. But even then, you're comparing bananas to jackalopes. I mean, it's like it's stuff that just doesn't even exist. That's why I tell guys, look, before you get worked up about getting a Hellcat, are you sure that you want a Hellcat? Do you want to live with a Hellcat? And do you want to live with the fact that you're dealing with a car that won't run with your car tire for tire on the street necessarily? I mean, it will, but it won't. There's softer feeling. There's a lot of things that the 392 has that the Hellcat simply doesn't in stock form. Now, just a tickle on the tune and a 309 gear, and your worldview becomes something wholly different. But you still don't get that super snappy feel that you get with a 392. So drive them and let that be the determining factor. But what I'll tell you is drive them in 500 horse mode. Drive that Hellcat in 500 horse mode. That will tell you all you need to know if you should keep the 392. I put it like this. I will do this. I drive mine around in 500 horse mode all the time. It makes the car feel like I've got just a good street setup 426. Like this imaginary engine that would be a street setup 426. That's what the 500 horse mode feels like in a Hellcat. It runs pretty good, and you can actually play with it quite a bit. Long time ago, RP Productions and I lined our cars up with him in 500 horse mode, and that damn car ran a freaking 1140 in 500 horse mode. So, yeah, I mean, it's a lot of fun. But you don't buy a Hellcat to put it in 500 horse mode. And it's still kind of lazy even with that. So anyway, hopefully that doesn't answer a question, just kind of walks you through some of what we were talking about and my reasoning behind some of that. Let's see. Let me catch up with some of you guys here. CJ's asking if I'm going to do any upgrades to Sierra in the near future. Yeah, it's going to get a starter for one. Let's see, between that, I may make a couple of jumpers for the neutral safety switches. I don't know if they're working as well as they should. Going to be work on some grounding issues that I just want to make sure I don't end up having. As far as any other upgrades are concerned, what would I or could I do to that truck? Really nothing more than just maintenance and fiddling around with certain things. Love the way that the truck runs, love the way that it sounds, love everything about how that truck is getting around town right now. So I cannot complain one bit about what that truck is up to. But yeah, there she is, peering right over our shoulder there. There's really nothing to upgrade on the truck at this stage of the game. I mean, what can you do? Again, it's just going to be more maintenance than anything else. Cody's asking, what are my thoughts on the Cherry Bomb Blast Pack? They're good. They sound kind of good. I like them. The larger the diameter, the better they sound. The little ones sound terrible, but the bigger ones always sound good. CJ is saying Scotty Kilmer always says stick to the NA. Yeah. Just depends on the kind of power delivery that you like. Let's see. Jordan is saying, what do you like about Mopar compared to other platforms? It depends on which platform or which one, which platform we're comparing. But for the car platforms, I like that the Mopar is sedan based. I like that the Mopars have stayed sedan based, where other manufacturers have kind of gone away from cars like the Charger, for example. You just don't see that with Chevrolet or Ford. One of the things that I like about them is that they are fairly true to their muscle car roots, in that they don't make anything that carries power really well out the back door versus how well they make power from, say, idle to 5,000 RPM. I love the driving experience. I like that their 8-speed automatics work extremely well. You got to remember that, the Mustang's got a 10-speed automatic, but the Mopar's had an 8-speed way before that. And Mopar's been pretty good about being first to the table when it comes to, putting cars together that are just fun to drive. So from a fun standpoint, Mopar kind of wins the conversation. They're always punchy. Even when they're not as fast on paper, the on paper portion, a lot gets lost in that translation. I've driven 10-speed cars that just didn't feel as fast as 8-speed cars for whatever reason. And again, Mopars being punchier, torquier, and just a bit livelier to drive. They're just more fun. Plus, there's a little bit of theater when it comes to the Mopars to begin with. I mean, that's, at some point, you want a little bit of pepper with your salt, and that's the thing that Mopar always had brought to me. It was always something a little bit different, a little bit cool. There was always a styling that I just liked more, and they're not slow. They run great, and for every advantage that a Mustang may have over a Scat Pack from a roll race, the rolls are reversed from a dig tire for tire. The old school flavor and feel of the Mopar is just kind of a cool place to be. And it would suffer significantly Mopar would suffer significantly if they tried to be more like Mustang or more like Camaro. This is one of those scenarios where, if you try to compete, you're competing from a losing position already. Those manufacturers aren't trying to compete with Mopar. Mopar's not trying to compete with Chevrolet and Ford in terms of, making something that's going to scream on the big end, roll racing or anything like that. And honestly, stock for stock, the vast majority of people don't modify their cars. So because the vast majority of people don't modify their cars, when you're looking at Mustang versus Camaro versus a Challenger, it's just really, each one kind of has their own individual niche. Throw the Charger into the mix though, and nobody can compare with that car because it's a 4-door and a very tight, riding 4-door as well. So that's what I prefer. That's one of the reasons why I prefer the Mopars. I just like driving them better than the Fords or the Chevrolets for sure. Now, from a number standpoint, I completely get that the Ford 5-liter with a 10-speed is going to be quicker. I'm talking about pickup trucks now. Or could be quicker. But it's just something about the power delivery of the Mopars. They're just snappier, torquier feeling. Again, just livelier feeling. Could be in the tune. That could be all that we're talking about is software, not even talking about hardware. And that can be making the difference. I will say this. I had put a tune on my old work truck. And it's the one that I was learning how to tune. Actually, when I worked for Pikes Performance, Alex was walking me through, how to do certain things with my truck. It was easy to tune on. And I had gone and driven, eerily enough, one of the 3.5 EcoBoost trucks. And I guess the EcoBoost truck would have been faster on paper, but it just didn't feel as good. Now, granted, my truck was tuned, but given the power differences and the gear ratios and everything else, he'd have thought it would be different. But the reality is the gear ratios are pretty close up to the 5th gear. And it wasn't as lively. And it wasn't as lively as my truck was stock anyway. So anyway, that's the reason why I like the Mopars a little bit more. They're just a little bit livelier to drive. Cody's saying that the Charger RT with the 309 gears wakes up the 5.7. Very true. One of the nitpicky bitches that I have about the RTs. Why is it that Mopar, Dodge, whatever, why would they ever put any other gear in that platform other than the 309? And can somebody explain that to me and realistically give me an answer that doesn't have anything to do with fuel economy? Because are we really going to talk about fuel economy with a V8 powered sedan? Like, you're not buying this thing because you're concerned about fuel economy. Put a flipping 309 into all of them and make sure it's limited slip. How do you not do that? It's the dumbest. Okay, you don't necessarily, all of them don't have to be limited slip. Fine, but at least give them all, take the 262, throw it away. It's a Hellcat gear. I get it. Works fine with that. It's like a vestigial organ from when that platform was a Mercedes-Benz platform. All their platforms had 262 gears. But anyway, getting back to it. Let's see. Sovereign's hanging out with CJ. Kurt's saying, thanks for the idea of Michelin tires for my truck. Good tires. CJ's hanging out with Sovereign. Moto's asking a cool question. How old is the Archangel battery in Revlon? Is she still cranking good? Yeah, she is doing real well. As a matter of fact, it's doing better than what you might think. No issues, no concerns, nothing out of that battery. That battery is what, 2.5 years old, I guess? Somewhere around that range. And she keeps on trucking. Trudy's asking, hey, B. Mason, what is your opinion on resto mods? They definitely can cost big dollars. Why would some cars... what would be some cars you would resto mod if you had the bucks? You got to remember that resto mod literally means two different things. They're twins. And so you have to pick which one you're talking about. Is it resto modernize or resto modify? So you've got to kind of take that in certain directions. If we're talking about resto mod, I like the trucks as a resto modify. I like the size of the truck and the stance of how you can get a truck to look with the bigger wheels and some of those things. Those look pretty good. So I would say if I was going to resto mod a car, I would probably go with a truck. Actually, I'd like to do a Suburban if I'm being honest. Now resto modernize, a la the tantrums out there and everything else. So what I would probably do, okay, so here's the problem. I don't really know how to say this. It's everybody has their favorite food, right? And let's say, for example, your favorite food is pasta. A little bit too much oregano is kind of hard to do because you're not going to overpower anything with that, but too much salt is, or using the wrong cheese might be, right? So the same thing happens in resto modernization, that portion of the resto mod. Everything's got an LS. So you can almost take that out of the equation in terms of, is it resto modded if it has an LS? Sure, yeah, it is. But it's like a pretty bland, way of getting into resto mod. Not to say that it's not expensive. You're still going to spend $5 or $6 on that to do it right. But then you start getting into other things, and you start jacking with interiors or doing real heavy engine swaps, like the Enigma Camaro or something like that, where it's way over the top, and we're talking about big money builds. I'm not a big fan of those cars because, number one, you can't really drive them. There's too damn much money invested into the thing. If anything minor happens to it, it's a major problem. And two, no matter what you've done to the chassis to be able to cope with the extra power that you've put into it, it's still a shitload of power in a car that is extremely light, which makes that car a one-trick pony at best. And it's just not a lot of fun to drive. So if you're talking about like a modernization side of resto mod, or rather a modification side, stick with the bigger stuff, the trucks and things like that. Stuff that's not necessarily going to ruffle a lot of purist feathers. There's just not a lot of cars that I think that look good with certain resto mod type setups. Like, I like any of the Camaros, any of the F-bodies, any of the Mustangs with like a Detroit Speed chassis, something along those lines. The G-Machine, if you remember that era where guys were really getting into making those cars handle, they got into the trucks. Everything has a chassis set up like that. So that's all fine and good, but it's once you start getting into the extremes of that aspect of the hobby, you start to lose me a little bit. And I don't know. Some of the resto mod stuff just looks cartoonish. To each their own. I would never try to tell somebody how to spend their money, but I would say this: resto modification, which is when you really start to hack up inner fender wells, putting big ass rims in it, that whole deal. Just remember that you're going to get bored with that at some point. Everybody does, and you're going to have to sell it. And you've got to sell that car to somebody that is going to have those exact tastes. Whereas if you're doing just a resto modernization, modernizing the engine, doing some electronics modernizing, whatever that could be, it could be something as simple as a overdrive transmission or something like that. That has universal appeal, and it makes the vehicle very easy to move on from it should you need to, want to, have to, whatever the case is. It won't owe you as much money, and again, it's a much easier flip. So again, it depends on how you are looking at the term, but at the end of the day, the bottom line, insert cliche here, it's whichever one you can flip the easiest. And what constitutes something like a resto modification, what is in bad taste? Because that's really what we're talking about, right? That's where this conversation eventually leads up to. People just say, man, that was just done in bad taste. I hate the way that was done. Too much body work. Rims look stupid. This looks dumb. That doesn't, whatever. Look, it all goes back to this. It's all somebody's vision. It's all somebody's artwork. It's all somebody's taste, right? It's what they like looking at. But I go back to this. There is no definition of what porn is, but I sure as shit know what it is when I'm seeing it. All right? What's the difference between porn and art? That's kind of the thing. What's the difference between a resto mod done in good taste and not? I don't know. I don't know what it is, but I certainly know what it looks like when I see it, whether it's good or bad. So Um, Tux is asking, what is my favorite fictional car? Like movie cars? I would say my first one would have to be the car from the movie The Car. And then my second one would be Christine. Well, I take it back. Christine, number one, and then like the same, in the same token, The Car from The Car. Both on equal footing for me. Summer saying 392s are so awesome. I agree. Saying 392 is a bit more practical than a Hellcat, in his opinion. Can be. Eerily enough, though, my Hellcat, when it was stock, got better fuel economy than my, my 392 did. Gary's saying, love my 6.4. Ken saying you're spot on about the 392s versus the Hellcat on the street. Hellcats will get you arrested for or worse on the street. Let me just expand on that a little bit. You know, while we're talking about that, and how that pertains to the topic. We got a little bit off topic there for, I don't know, about the last hour. So old school versus new school. Let me tell you the difference between old school versus new school. Old school, faster than hell cars. Take a Hemi Roadrunner, probably one of my single favorite cars from the era, and run that car out with, I don't know, 373 gears, because you're going to need a gear to get to this number. Probably less than that, probably 331, 323 style gear to get to 140 miles an hour, a legit 140 miles an hour. With that gear in that car is a turd to drive around on the street, but it will go 140 miles an hour. A Hellcat, bone stock Hellcat, anybody can go to the dealership and buy it. And at the time, anybody could go to the dealership and buy a Hemi Roadrunner with the most highway gear you could get. That car will accelerate on a 10-second pace at the drag strip through the number of 140 miles an hour on its way to a top speed of, just as much as it doesn't make a difference, 200 miles an hour. It will go 200 miles an hour. It will go 60 miles an hour faster on a top speed than what would be considered the baddest car on the planet, with a gear allowing it to go 140 miles an hour. It will go the equivalent of somebody cruising down the highway miles per hour faster than that car. That's the difference. Top dog versus top dog. And by the way, we're just talking about the Hellcat. We're not talking about a Red Eye or a Demon or anything like that. Although the Hellcat might be better for highway use. That's the difference. You go, well, Hemi doesn't have a supercharger. I take a 392. It'll do the same thing, except it will only go 175 or 180 something miles an hour. You can kind of see the point that I'm trying to make here. There is absolutely no comparison when you start talking about speeds and how that relates to an old school versus new school car. Again, it's not a knock on the old school cars. It's just that I am flabbergasted every time I start getting these bouquets of messages that are something like, it ain't a real Hemi, thing's slow, doesn't make the torque, doesn't do this, etc., blah, blah, whatever. Insert the exact same thing. It's like I just hit play, rinse and repeat. And it's almost like somebody just forgets. I feel like this is not the only car that I've ever messed with. That's kind of the whole point of this. And, it's Mopar Chat Live. There ain't a Mopar in this garage. And so it's just kind of funny when we're talking about it in that respect, like, which one of these old school cars do you go out and pick that is going to sit there and absolutely rip past a newer car today? One of the funnier things is and I forget when this was done. God, this was done a while back. Somebody took a 63 Corvette, something like that. 327 car, I think is what it was. And they compared it to like a Honda Odyssey minivan. And in every measurable metric, the minivan kicked the crap out of this vet. And it, it was just like, ooh, that was ugly to watch. And that's one of the things that you just, progress progresses, and that's how it is. But what I wanted to do, kind of circling this back to the topic, what I wanted to do was give reasons for the gross horsepower rating. A lot of people don't realize that there is a very good reason to rate engines in gross horsepower based on the times that we're talking about. Again, it is a power plant. It was used in a lot of different applications. Could have been any application: boats, trucks, cars. The list goes on and on. And so you never rated it based on the platform. You rated it based on the fact that it was a power plant that was capable of this power number. That means something. And it wasn't until later where the way that people were looking at the power and they're looking at these things going, yeah, I don't think it's making quite that much power. Like the number is, although the number itself is not fake, the way that it is installed into these cars makes the number fake. It takes the validity away from the dyno that was at the original manufacturer. And so the way that those engines are rated has to be changed, hence the net horsepower. But to say that there is any advantage whatsoever of those cars back then versus the cars today is, quite frankly, being intellectually dishonest with yourself if you're inclined to be one of those types. It's intellectually dishonest to carry that conversation much farther than styling, much farther than feel, much farther than anything which is subjective. Because from any objective metric, it is significantly lower in tier, regardless of how it's measured. So anyway, let's get back to you guys. Oh, and one other thing about Ken's point. So the difference also is these newer cars, especially when you're talking about the Hellcat, you will find yourself accidentally going 120 miles an hour in a Hellcat. You won't even notice it, especially if there's really nobody else on the street. You're really not in it to win it. You're just kind of going down the highway. You're playing around with, you could be playing around with the radio. You're messing around with something else, whatever the case is. You can literally tip into the throttle to go around somebody, kind of move back into the lane, and you look down and holy crap, I'm going triple digits. And not even mean to do it. And that's like that with the ZL1. It's like that with the Z06. Any of these modern cars actually kind of get like that. So at speeds which normally would be like, oh my God, I can't believe you're going that fast. And now it's just, there's just nothing to it. I mean, my wife is so used to it. I mean, we're clipping along at 120, 140, and she's just, just playing on her phone, So anyway, that's when she's helping me data log. David saying, instead of a Hellcat, you should just get a 68 Hearst Hemi Dart. Now that's old school. Yeah. How much are those things going for these days? You could get one, if it's an original Hemi Dart, you could get a Hellcat for you and probably a few of your friends for what that car would actually go for. Xcash is saying the only NA engine that's better than the 392 is the LS7. I would have to agree with that. That's a really good one. Now, here's the weird thing. Horsepower for horsepower, there's really no difference between the two. But man, I tell you what, the tip-in torque on the LS7, pretty impressive. But the fact of what you can get out of the LS7, plus it's a 427, Yeah, it steps it up a little bit, I would have to say. But here's the weird thing. The 392 again is it's not that far behind it in terms of actual power production. From what I've seen on the dynos versus, what I've seen, the things just the way that they run in general. Yeah, I do love that LS7 though. A lot. In fact, at one point, this is the weird thing. After having my C5 Z06, I got the 392 Challenger. And the reason why I did that is because I grew to hate the C5. And I wanted something bigger. I wanted something more comfortable. I didn't want to have a platform that was just kind of claustrophobic, that ran like it was on a buckboard. Plus, I couldn't ever get comfortable in a C5. But I did test drive a C6 Z06, and that changed my mind quite a bit. So, I don't know, came about close to buying that car. Hang on. Kobe, thank you very much. Asking for the contribution, saying what would be the what would be the Hellcat gross and net power? Kind of hard to say, but I will put it to you like this. If you do the math, if you back math the Hellcat, the number is kind of around that 750 to 770 range. So, and that's just what we've seen on dynos. Like if you compare something that was gross horsepower rated at, I don't know, 400 horsepower. And that thing will put down, I don't know, 330-ish to the rear wheels. What's weird is that, the way that these things read is all SAE. Here's the problem. So to answer the question, the generally accepted answer is around 750, 770. The thing is you have to have the dyno reading with no correction, no SAE correction, and no correction factor to get to a gross number. And most of the time, most dynos don't do that. I have green screened some pretty high numbers on a Mustang dyno, but even with that, there's still going to be a certain level of correction that's going to be involved because it's a loaded dyno. But for the most part, generally accepted numbers around 750-ish horsepower. And a lot of the reason for that, by the way, a lot of the reason for that is that engine, when it's put on a dyno, is not going to be, there's not very much restriction in it from the factory. And that's one of the things that you have to remember. Modern engines, not like Exhibit A over here, but modern engines, the catalytic converters are not much of a restriction. The exhaust system itself is really not much of a restriction. The manifolds are not much of a restriction. So that's getting to the point. That's one of the reasons why there's not a huge difference and why there's not a whole lot of discrepancy between gross and net horsepower. Like, in other words, it's not 140 horsepower. That 20% thing doesn't really apply here, mainly because another exhaust system is not going to be better than what comes on that car from the factory. It is a flow-through exhaust system with very little in terms of restriction. The intake side is incredibly free-flowing, and so that does not offer up a restriction. In fact, it's actually a great intake system that is incredibly difficult to beat from the aftermarket. So even running that thing with an open throttle body isn't going to be hugely different than running it with the intake box and the filter and everything else. And I've been able to prove this both with data and at the drag strip. So again, and when I say the general consensus of the 750, that general consensus of 750 is with optimal fueling and basically leaving the timing alone. The engines don't really get a big kick out of timing. The Hellcat engines don't. But they do help out with a little bit of fueling. So if you throw some fuel at it, it does pick up some power. But there's just not that big of a difference. And the same applies for the 392s as well. There's just not, if you put long tubes on it, tuned it for the long tubes, and started really kind of getting into the nth degree on those things, that's where you can start to pick up power on an engine dyno with a 392. And instead of 485, the real number might be something like 5.25, something like that. But anyway, hopefully that answers that question. Good question though. I like it. Let's see. Rich is saying, the companies that made the supercharger for the Hellcat, IHI, also made superchargers for aircraft. They may have. I can tell you that from a power to weight standpoint, Root superchargers are typically not going to be found on aircraft. Normally you'll see turbocharging, and that's just because they're the most efficient means of producing power. But if you were to put a Root style supercharger onto something that is weight sensitive, then IHI would be a good way to go because they are incredibly efficient. Especially the 2.4 that's on the Hellcat. Let me get back up here. Cody's saying you could literally go to the junkyard and get an LS for like $300 fully assembled. I'm just kind of going through the things like, really? So yeah, you can, but I will caution you if you decide to do that. I mean, so a full kit engine and transmission with the harness, the computers, and everything else is going to run somewhere around $1,500. Okay. If you're just talking about the engine, yeah, you could probably find one for $300, but it's a gamble. And there are rarely any guarantees when it comes to picking out an engine from a scrap yard. So just know that coming into that conversation. Let's see. I'm just kind of skipping through here on some of these questions. Cody's asking, my only question is, why is the Charger faster than the Challenger? That is because of aerodynamics, if you're talking about top speed. Where the Challengers are losing while the Chargers either keeping up or straight up blast the opponent. Well, there's no blasting the opponent. I mean, they're the same car. At the very big end, the Charger will have a 2 mile an hour advantage, 2 to 3 mile an hour advantage over the Challenger, just based around aerodynamics. It's just slipperier. But no, I mean, unless we're talking about tire for tire, mod for mod, whatever. The Challenger, because it's lighter, will typically be quicker through the quarter mile. With the Charger, if you were to just leg it out, the Charger would have a slight advantage at the top speed. Let's see. David's saying, the 413 Ramjet. Those are nice. I was always a big fan of the 426 and the wedge motors. Let's see. Randy's asking, talking about how the factory tricks for the 5.7 would be up near the 6.1 numbers. Do you think the 5.7 is intentionally kept lower to keep the gap of the 5.7 to the 6.4? Bro, I've been saying that for a while now. It's just a little bit too good with those heads. And if you were to put the truck intake or the 6.4 intake, for that matter, on the 5.7, you would pick up another probably 20 horsepower, at least 15. And so you're looking at 15, 370. Now you're looking at 385, 390, right? Just like the truck. So there's no difference between the two, right? So if you get the same power figures out of the truck, now you're looking at basically 400 and 400 out of the 5.7. With the 6.4 being at 485, believe it or not, that's not that big of a difference. 85 horsepower and 85 pound-feet of torque sounds like a lot, but the driving experience is not that far removed one from the next. Yeah, it's different, but it's not wholly different. I really think that it's something they need to do for the 5.7. And I say that being a 392 guy that's pissed that they haven't done anything with a 392. I mean, that platform, that engine itself is 10 years old at this point, and nothing honestly really has changed. So, I would like to see the 5.7 upgraded. It needs to have the right intake manifold on it. It needs to have the right exhaust manifolds put on it. There's another 10 right there just with an exhaust system. And I'm saying that conservatively, but that puts you at 410, maybe even 415. So 415 versus 485 is even less than a difference than what you would find with just the intake swap. Factor in a 309 with a limited slip, and now you've got a combination that is really kind of a lot of fun to drive and won't be as expensive as a 6.4. By the way, now's about the time where you got to start telling me what the cost difference would be between the two. They're both the same block. They're both the same, not the same crank, but you get the idea here. There's a lot of similarity A-B between the two engines at this stage, with the 6.4 having a forged crank versus a cast crank in the 5.7. But we ain't talking about top fuel dragsters here. We're talking about street cars that are only going to rev to 6,000, 6,300 RPM. What starts to look better at that point? Well, I would probably say that a 415, 420 horse 5.7 versus a 485 horse 6.4, there's just not going to be that much of a difference. And that's why I'm saying it's a real slippery slope, and they are intentionally neutered, I would say, anyway, in my opinion, to keep that delta between 392 and 5.7 as wide as they can keep it. Let's see. CJ's talking about his dad's car waking up the neighbors. I get that. 1320 saying, why would they put the 9-speed trans in a Jeep Cherokee with the 3.2 liter V6? I'm at 95 miles an hour in 7th gear, and it won't even shift into 8th or 9th in manual mode. Man, I don't think that thing needs a lot more gears than that. I don't know. I'm beside myself with the newer Jeeps right now. You cannot put an engine that is focusing on high-end power in something that is as heavy as a Jeep. People understand. People see Jeeps and they go, oh, little cute little Jeep. Those things weigh a shite load for what they are. And I keep going back to my wife's Jeep. It's the old 3.8, and it's got a 4-speed automatic, and it's that 3.8 and that Jeep is punchy. It's grunty down low, and in a way that the modern stuff just is not. And if you're asking me which one would I rather drive, I'll take my keys to my wife's Jeep every time, because the newer Jeeps that I've driven, you're in it and you're standing on it to get the thing to move. And it just does it, but it's begrudgingly. It's almost like the thing is just, I don't know, man. Anyway, I feel your pain, my friend. George saying, your opinion on overhead valve versus single overhead cam. For me, single overhead cam is basically, what's the point of single overhead cam? If you're using a single overhead cam architecture to take advantage of what you can do with the cylinder heads in that configuration in terms of port placement, port shaping, then the single overhead cam is good. If you're doing it specifically for, I don't know, reasons, I've got to have a reason to want a single overhead cam over the overhead valve architecture, cam and block. The single overhead cam is by design better than a cam and block. I mean, single overhead cam engines go back well over 100 years. They literally go back to like the Hall Scott engines. You guys know I used to be a docent at a museum. I was the engine specialist and would walk folks through, you know, the different engines. And it was funny. A lot of the guys were really surprised to see these, you know, engines that are over 100 years old that were all gear driven, actually shaft driven, gear driven overhead cam engines. I think, wow, that's a modern thing. It's actually a solution to a pain in the ass of getting valves to move. The easiest way to do it is to have the lobe hit a follower that pushes the thing up and down. It's just right there. If I were designing an engine, I would literally have never thought to put the cam in the block. I just, like, why would you even do that? It makes it more complicated. Now I got these push rods that are going to potentially limit RPM. And it's like, what do I do? It's something else to bend or break. Anyway, but it is what it is. I mean, you know, overhead valve architecture, geometry, everything else works just fine. I like it for packaging better. But for longevity, single overhead cam is technically going to do better. Now, if it's a 2-valve single overhead cam, well, it would be in that case, typically. You could have 4-valve though. It depends on what we're talking about. We're talking about LS versus, you know, a 4.6 SOHC. I'll take the LS. If we're talking about, you know, something else, it depends on what we're talking about. But single overhead cam is going to technically be better. Ken's asking, are old school cars more consistent at the track than the new cars because of the nannies and the tuning? No, actually the nannies help for consistency, and you can turn them off to a certain degree, but with old school stuff, you've got to keep temperatures just right. You've got to have everything more or less in a very predictable zone. Newer stuff, you don't have to. Newer stuff, it just, you punch it and it rattles on down the track. It's all good. Oh, Sovereign saying, and they are super comfortable in the Challenger and Charger. Yeah, they are. Let's see. We touched on Cody's question about which one is faster and why. Sovereign saying, Mopar, that angry, powerful, raging V8 like a punch in the face. Oh, CJ's saying the Taurus was boring compared to the Charger. Well, I mean, it wasn't even the same, in the same ballpark. CJ was saying Mopar, no car. Some are saying could be because the EPA requirements can't sell them with a 309. Yeah, you know, I get it. But, you know, the CAFE standards, which is the corporate average fuel economy, the CAFE standard. The problem with that, though, is that, I mean, there's not that big of a difference, and you would think that there would be more cars optioned with a 309 than a 262. I don't know. It just, here's the thing with that. You are gaming the system at that point. It's really all you're doing. I mean, it is what it is. I mean, you're gaming the system when you start getting into CAFE standards. And by the way, that is exactly how the EcoBoost engines would get their numbers, is that they were tested in this real low load, steady state environment. And, you know, they would rattle, and this is any turbocharged car for that matter, but they are tested in this very low load, steady state environment. And there's a portion in the testing, I can't remember exactly which portion it is, but that's what it is, where, you know, the fuel economy number just goes through the roof on the engine. But any power enrichment mode that is going to actually keep that engine held together with modern gasoline throws a shitload of fuel at it and yanks all the timing out, which kills all the efficiency. So anyway, real world results are different. Let's see. Rich, you are exactly right about the aerodynamics. Jordan's asking, have you driven a Jeep SRT? Yes. How did you like them? Loved it. And what don't you like? They're expensive. Loved every bit of it. And again, you start looking at the cost of it. And I mean, who are they marketing some of those vehicles to? cars have gotten astronomically expensive, and I know pretty rich coming from a guy that owns a Hellcat, but you understand where I'm going with this. Just in general, car cost is ridiculous. So, but yeah, that's what I loved it. I love the way that they handled, love the way that they drove. So I'm saying Resto Mod modernized 1970 Dodge Challenger. The problem, here's the thing, the thing with older cars, when you go to Resto Mod or modernize them, is that to do it right, you have to basically hack up the fender wells of the car, not the inner fender wells, but the opening, the actual opening on the side of the car needs to be made bigger. I've seen guys try to run 17-inch wheels, and because 17s were a thing there for a while. And when they would put 17s on the cars, or 18s were even worse, the look of the thing, it just looked like it didn't match. It looked like the wheels were clashing with the styling of the car. The cars were designed for, at largest, a 15-inch wheel with a 70 aspect ratio tire. That's what looks the best. It's what balances the whole look of the car out. When you start to mess with that balance, it starts to look a little bit, that's what I say, cartoonish. It just doesn't look right. It's imbalanced. And that's why, the Challenger to me, I mean, it kind of is what it is, but the Challenger to me was one of the ones that it looked the worst on. That, like a 69 Camaro looks pretty good. I've seen guys try to do this with AMXs and it just doesn't play out. It doesn't play nice. It's just so hard with the way that the cars were shaped to get the larger wheels with the shorter aspect ratio tires in there and have it look good and have the car look good without the wheel itself clashing with the styling of that vehicle. So anyway, Tuxedo saying, nice choice on fictional cars you picked. Have you ever seen the General Lee and the Knight Rider before, though? Oh, yeah. I'm very, very well versed in those. What was the name? Speaking of Knight Rider, he had Kit, Car, and Goliath. Goliath, I think, is the name of the 18-wheeler. Rich Foley saying, Hellcat is basically an aircraft engine put in a car. Power-wise, it just about is. Cody's saying, imagine if Toyota and Mopar created a vehicle that had a 6.2 liter twin turbo and an 8-speed. Knowing Toyota, they would overbuild the engine to handle customer driving habits. I don't know. Knowing them, they just leave everything up to Dodge. That's what they did with BMW when they made the Supra. So, let's see. Dad's is saying, I've heard many times that 392 horsepower is underrated. Any truth to that? Have you run dyno numbers on a stock 392? So I haven't seen, I take it back. I've only seen one test where they ran a 392 on an actual engine dyno, but I don't know any of the parameters and I don't know what they were correcting or set to. But I think it came out to 475 horsepower on the engine dyno. I don't think that they're really underrated. I think that what you have to understand is that the 392, any modern engine for that matter, the 392 is not a one-trick pony from the factory in that you've got variable cam and variable intake manifold. For example, when I put a cam together for a 392, or really for any of them, 5.7, it doesn't matter, you don't use the variable cam feature anymore. You basically, you lock that cam in position. Because I want the intake valve to open at a specific time. I want the exhaust valve to close at a specific time. You kind of get the idea. And moving that around, it doesn't really do a lot. When you've got significantly larger duration numbers and things like that, moving the cam around can kind of muddle up the power curve. It doesn't make it better the way that the tight, short duration, high lift cams, moving that around, that's where you get that wide sweep on the power curve. So because of all of that, the 392 makes power like an old truck engine down low. It makes power like it gets as much power as it can out of the intake manifold through the mid-range, and then it has a short runner actuator that helps it make power like it's got a single plane intake manifold on the big end. As much as it can, given the architecture that it's working with the manifolds. So is it underrated? No, it's not underrated. But what it does do is it makes a lot of power over a very broad range, especially down low. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of folks say, this thing makes a lot more power than it's rated at. It's like, it doesn't, but it probably feels like that. And if you've ever seen the power curve, I mean, it starts out high and it just stays high the whole time. Sovereign saying, I was thinking it's 45 of the crank and 440-ish to the wheels. Most of them will put down 430 on a dyno jet. On a Mustang dyno, they range anywhere from 405 to 415-ish on a loaded dyno jet. Tux is asking, what cars can the Dodge Charger Hellcat beat and what cars can the Pontiac Trans Am beat? Well, that's a really broad spectrum. I'll put it to you like this. The Hellcat will beat a lot of cars for talking about on a drag strip. You're looking at probably, I don't know, anything that will run quicker than a 1090 is going to beat a stock Hellcat. But think of what you have to do to get a car to run that kind of a number. It's really difficult to get to that number. And the TA is a good car, but I wouldn't try to run it against a lot of stuff. I mean, it's a good car for its day, but by today's standards, not as fast. Let's see. Jordan went over the single overhead cam thing. CJ's talking about a Grand Marquis. We'll see you later, man. Rich is asking, how long will Stellantis delay refreshing the Challenger and Charger? Well, I have heard that the LX platform is going to be carried through 2025. The original number was 2023, and that's when there was going to be some kind of a refresh, revamp, reimagining, if you will. That was going to include a switch to either the Ghibli platform, which I don't know the actual name of that, but the platform that the Ghibli's built on, or the Giulia platform, which was kind of scrapped early on initially. That idea was anyway, if it was even a legit idea. The thing is that the LX platform, the licensing agreement is still licensed through Mercedes-Benz. It's a Mercedes platform. It's the old E-Class platform with some S-Class bits. It's W211 platform with W212, which is the S-Class, older S-Class suspension bits. So that licensing was re-upped at some point to include the 2023 model year. Now, my understanding is that it has been re-upped to include the 2025 model year. Where it goes from there, I have got no clue, but that is a pretty long freaking run, if you ask me. Basically, 20-year-long run, give or take, to get to that point. And where it goes from there, again, like I say, I have no clue. There were some folks talking about, again, imagining the car as a smaller car. I don't know that that plays well for the marketing, the message that they're sending out with that particular car. I just don't know that it doesn't promote synergy within the brand at that point. If we're talking about that car moving forward the way that it sits, my understanding, in other words, being the bigger car, the muscle car, the bigger sedan alternative, My understanding is that there was going to be a tweak to the LX platform, possibly lightening it up. But man, I got to tell you, even if you took 200 pounds out of that car, it's not going to be worlds different. So there's that. It just doesn't, 200 pounds, when you're talking about 4,500 pounds, it's just not that big of a difference. It is on the drag strip, but for just in general purpose driving, you wouldn't know one from the next. So that's my understanding of how that's going. Oh, Dad's is saying, talking about at Sovereign. So the question about the at 500 to the crank. So it depends. Here's one way you have to remember. Remember, we're talking about horsepower ratings and we're talking about SAE net. What we didn't talk about with SAE net is the actual net ratings are different. You've got two different net ratings. The older 1307 is not the same as the newer, can't remember the numbers. Usually I know this off the top of my head, but it's getting late. Anyway, they're different by about 4%. So if you add the roughly 20 horsepower, just for lack of a better way of putting it, to the 392's 485, because again, it's a 4% sweep, and that's just based on the temperature that the old SAE was corrected to, which was 60 degrees at 29.92 inches of mercury. No, was it 60 at 30? Anyway, I start to get these kind of backwards, a little bit dyslexified, but the newer one is set to 70 degrees. And so the higher temperature basically drops that number down, that corrected number down a little bit. And it ends up, the bottom line, just don't worry about all that. It's basically 4%. So if you add 4%, go 485 divided by, don't get it the other way around. Don't multiply by 1.04. That's not how math works. 485 divided by 0.96 will get you probably 505 if I'm just beep, somewhere around that number. And that's why some people will say, oh, it's underrated. It's like, no, it's not underrated. It's rated properly for the SAE that it was rated under. Those specifications, it's doing just fine. If you back math it, you get into that, then let's say it's right around 505 horsepower. The old, like we're talking about the LS7, that one would probably be more like 515-ish, I think, if you corrected it to the old temperature numbers. But that's why that's like that. The standard correction, by the way, is always going to be a standard correction to 60 degrees. SAE correction is supposed to be to 70 degrees. You can get into the barometric pressure and stuff like that, but that's why that number is always lower. Cody's saying there's a noticeable shortage. Yeah, there is. Let's see. Oh, Dad's saying, I bet he has seen real numbers. Yeah, I've seen all kinds of, that's the problem. Here's the thing. When it comes to numbers, here's the other thing. It's a little too easy. If I'm being really honest, it's real easy after a not long amount of time to get numbers numb. It's like you can't say numbers without numb. You become numb to them. You become not necessarily apathetic, but once you understand the differences in how engines are rated and how dynos read and all this other stuff, certain numbers, they don't really matter. It's like they matter, but they don't matter. Perfect example of this, if y'all are a fan of like Richard Holdner or all the stuff that he does on a dyno, or Engine Masters and everything that they do, those are all uncorrected numbers in a very controlled environment. But they're all uncorrected, and those engines are run at unrealistic engine temperatures with a combination of unrealistic by comparison to engine temperature and intake temperatures are all, I mean, it's not unrealistic, but it's not like what you would typically find, in 80%, 85% of your driving experiences with that particular power plant. The only reason why I'm bringing that up is because those are completely uncorrected numbers. If you correct them, things get really funky when you start to try to correct numbers. Even though I always try to give DA information so that folks in other parts of the world can compare their car to my car, and you can always correct to my car because I always give DA information. When it comes to engine stuff, the only things that I care about is the barometric pressure, is the weather station in essence for the dyno reading correctly, is the temperature right, is the baro right, and is the thing set up to read properly? If it's set up for tire speed mode, is it measuring it properly? These are things that would just drive me nuts and wake me up in the middle of the night going, okay, was that done the right way? There's stuff like that. So you end up, there's so many things that lead up to the number that the number is like, okay, fine, it's done, get it off the dyno. Talking about tuning and everything else, the final result is practically irrelevant, provided that the result is indicative of a healthy engine when it comes off of that dyno. So, and I know that, again, I know it sounds kind of apathetic and it's, easy for you to say, you're around this all the time. I was around it all the time. Not anymore, and I'm still like that. It's kind of these residual effects. For those that are around this stuff all the time, believe me when I tell you, the does it matter portion of the conversation just goes away quickly. But so that what is the difference in the numbers? Those are the differences in the numbers. And those numbers matter. And I get it. Those numbers matter to folks. And, we always were sensitive and are sensitive of that. But explaining to somebody why an engine doesn't make a certain number on the dyno is like beating your head against a wall. And that's the reason why a lot of dyno shops, folks are just there to, read a number, and people use their dyno for tuning. They'll adjust the dyno to make a real favorable number. And that screws things up for everybody because there's ways you can manipulate the dyno to consistently give a higher number or a lower number. And when that is done, it consistently creates a lot of doubt and a lot of issues for folks. And I've even, I had my car on a dyno, and I even told the guy, I was like, dude, it was before a Mopar Fest deal. It's been a few years ago. I said, set the parameters up to where it's going to read like a normal, Mustang dyno. It was a Mustang dyno, and they were given some real cherry dyno jet looking numbers. Like, there's no way the cars could have made these numbers in real life. And I was like, just set it up, and the car made proper Mustang dyno numbers. And I was like, yeah, okay. So anyway, again, you get, God, and this is one of the reasons why a lot of guys will pull a ripcord in the industry, is because a dyno is just a tool, and you're using it to get a number, and you're using it to get a reading, and you're using it to make sure that you are moving in the right direction with your tuning. And a lot of times when you're setting up a car to run on a dyno, a lot of guys will run on wheel sensed speed as opposed to trying to read RPM. You get pickups that don't read right, pickups that get cooked. Some cars are hard to, like Hellcats are a bitch to get RPM pickups on. So anyway, a long story short, they don't have plug wires, so, and they're hard to get to plug anyway. So you get the car on the dyno, you get it strapped down, you just go through your procedure doing wheel sensed, and then you start making numbers, and you're just looking for percentages of up or down. You're not really caring of like, what is it making? Like, okay, it looks about right. It seems like in the healthy range for this thing. But then the customer comes in. They want to see this thing make a bananas number. And you're just like, I don't really, it does what it does. It's like trying to tell you that my 1/2-inch wrench is really a 15, but it's not, I don't understand. And that's why, guys that do a lot of tuning, they just go, I don't understand. This is stupid. Like you got this 400 horsepower car that you're tripping out over a number on. I'm over here dealing with, 6, 7, 800 horsepower cars that we're trying to have hold together on shitty pump gas. And somebody's freaking out over 5 horsepower on this other car. Not that it's less than, but it's less than, and the thing is healthy. It's fine. It runs great. Go out there and have fun. I'm saying all of that to illustrate one goofy fact. My car, Shalandra, the white SRT 392, that car made the least amount of power on the dyno of any 392 car that we ever had at the shop. The least. And it was the quickest by a significant margin. Huh? Like, how is that, right? Driver mod. No, what driver mod? It was the fact that we just didn't we weren't setting up the thing to try to get a number out of it. And when I say setting up the thing, I'm talking about the dyno. We were just using the dyno as the tool that it was meant to be used for. So anyway, that was always kind of the running joke, is that my cars, when they set records, have always been the lowest horsepower number on the dyno, Revlon included, by the way. In fact, Chris's car, the Go Mango Hellcat, his car with my exact tune makes more power than my car does. So, and mine's quicker. So, God dang it. Anyway, getting back to it here. Let's see. Pitch Black, thank you very much, asking, is a diff brace needed for a stock 19 Charger 392? No. We'll be running drag radials, any other rear suspension mods or tips for wheel hop, etc. Thank you. Got the arm flex. So here's the deal. I ran a set of BMR lower trailing arms on mine, and I ran a diff brace. Is it necessary? I don't know that it's necessary, but it certainly won't hurt anything. And I liked having the diff brace in the car. So I would say in that respect, go for it. I got the performance diff brace. I don't even know what generation they're on at this point, but it's the one that basically allows you to drain the diff on, with the car, with the brace on the car. A little bit of a pain in the ass to install. You're going to need to have thin wall sockets and a torque wrench. Don't go over 90 foot-pounds. I'd say 80, 85, you're good for the case. And go from there, should you choose to put that on there. But between the diff brace and the lower trailing arms, which literally it takes you longer to get the tools together and get the car on the ramps than it does to do the swap on those trailing arms. And I've got a video on how to do, I think, both of those in the how-to section. The thing is how do you control wheel hop? The best way to control wheel hop is to run the right tire at the drag strip or on the street, and to run the right air pressure. What I find is that guys run too low of air pressure on the street. I have pattern tested ET Street SS's, and I've pattern tested the Tri-5s, and I've pattern tested the Tri-5 R2. All of them seem to like around 28 pounds of pressure, both at the drag strip and on the street. I know it sounds like a lot, but when I pattern tested them on the street, that's what left the cleanest patch. And when I run them at the drag strip, at that power level for a 392, there wasn't a reason to have any wrinkle wall. You're just relying on the track prep and a stickier tire to get you off the line. Some guys will say run them at 16 or 18. I'm going, God, no, don't do that. The lowest I would ever recommend running those tires on a prepared drag strip would be at 22 PSI. That's where we found with the Hellcats that the ET Street SSs seem to like to be at 22, but I was able to make the newer Nitto Tri-5 R2s that I run is more or less my street setup, which I will be moving away from here at some point fairly soon, probably within the next year. I was running those at 28 pounds and they dead hooked, but the track prep was really good. So just kind of word to the wise on that. And running that pressure on the street, I never did really run into any issues with wheel hop. Again, but that's going to be, you're going to have some throttle control in there as well. But diff brace and lower trailing arms, I feel helps with that. So that's what I would do. By the way, I like the BMR, don't like the Spawn. The Spawn are clickety clackety like you would not believe. Go in, watch the how-to video on my, damn, somebody's hauling ass, on the Spawn lower trailing arms. That will give you an idea as far as some of the, some of the headaches. Anyway, that was mainly for the forward trailing arms, or the leading arms, I should say. Again, the downside to the Spawn, they're just noisy. I just didn't like them. BMRs are good though. Oh, Sovereign saying, good job on smashing that like. Thank you all very much. I really do appreciate that, guys. Madeira saying, oh, he's hanging out with Sovereign. Oh, saying just an intake, exhaust, and a tune would make the truck 392 run like a car 392? No, not at all. I mean, you're missing a cam in there. There's a lot that the truck has, or the car has that the truck doesn't. But it would get you fairly close. And that intake does make a significant difference. Sovereign saying, not sure, but according to what B was saying, those types of changes can influence power. Yes, and keep in mind that those changes will require a tune. Rich said, I think the Scat 1320 is best bang for the buck. It doesn't even get a lot of press, but it's got Demon launch text. It does, and it's pretty darn good. I like the, I've got a long story about how I was very critical of the 1320, but then because a buddy of mine had bought one, had really changed my mind in a lot of ways about that car. So yeah, great car, big fan of it. You can use every ounce of power, and they're plenty fast for the street. And if you're taking it to a drag strip, you're never going to get embarrassed with one of those cars. Car for car. I mean, they're just really good. It's a mid 11-second car on any given day. And it's going to take a modified variant of pretty much any of the big threes offerings to beat it. Dad's is saying, thanks for the great info as always, B. Great job as always. Thank you very much. Thanks for hanging out, man. I appreciate it. Pitch Black's got the thumbs up. I like it. Hey, Doc Diff made it in saying he's in late, but he is in here. Been busy as hell and I had to replace my phone. Snapped it up. Doing good, man. Yeah, I actually had to get a new phone myself. But guys, with that, I am going to go ahead and check out. We are at almost 2.5 hours in. Appreciate each and every one of you guys hanging out with me. Love each and every one of you. Couldn't do this without you. And I'm going to wrap it up. If you're going to send it, don't bend it. Keep your shiny side up. Stay healthy out there. And I will catch y'all on the next one. And that's a wrap. Adios.